Okay, all right. So what I'll be presenting today amounts to a small piece of my larger dissertation work, which for the past year and a half has grown and grown, bolstered by oral histories and intensive correspondence with trans women who lived in the upper Midwest in the 1970s, their gay male activist allies, their legal aid attorneys, and local politicians they lobbied, worked with, and fought against. I originally thought I would write a presentation more about the particular methods of doing trans history as a trans historian, as the panel's title suggests. And that's something I do love to talk about, so do talk to me after about that. There are certainly long conversations to be had about how to reach out to trans people as a historian, how to protect people's privacy and dignity in this political moment, and generally how to write and do trans histories in the most ethical way possible. I feel compelled, though, to instead share some histories of trans women's activities within conventional politics in Minnesota in the mid-1970s, inspired by some particular juicy archive finds in the past few months, and with an eye to contemporary concerns about trans visibility, appeals to authority, and political strategy. The queen you saw on the title slide and the one you see on this slide are both completely unknown to me. The first image is by the gay photographer John Hustad, taken in downtown Minneapolis at Pride in 1975. This one is a press photo of a gay protest outside the Minnesota governor's mansion in 1973. Even after sharing these images with trans women and gay activists who I thought might remember these anonymous figures, I was coming up short. I choose these images then very intentionally to symbolize a particularly fragmentary and sly nature within trans histories, the way they reward careful, repeated viewings, a critical and questioning eye, and the imagination to wonder how many unnamed politically engaged queens there might be for each one that appears to us in an archive. On a warm summer day 50 years ago, our topless, wand-waving fairy queen paid no mind to a sneering, disapproving onlooker. In these times, where else might we take a lesson? In the spring of 1969, the hippie friends Corinne Phelps and Stephen Eyrig, one lesbian and one gay, founded Fight Repression of Erotic Expression, or FREE, Minnesota's first gay liberation organization. Within a few months, a coterie of especially turned-on, pissed-off gay activists had come into the organization, and they immediately pushed it to take oppositional, public stances along a particular set of commitments. Foremost among those commitments was an insistence on gays' claim to public space, the desire to see gays' worth reflected in the press, in government policy and administrative procedure, and a drive for protections, recognition, and generally redress of grievances. These activists, Jack Baker, Michael McConnell, Tom Higgins, and Tim Campbell foremost, are both very mappable onto the larger histories of gay liberation activism in the early 70s, and also very unique in their engagement with conventional politics and attachments that some might now erroneously consider to be normative or assimilationist, ones like marriage rights, legal non-discrimination protections, and appeals to judicial authority. Trans women would operationalize these commitments and strategies by the mid-1970s because they were in FREE from the very beginning. As I thumbed through records of FREE meetings in its first year, I was stunned to see this handwritten note at the bottom of one otherwise unremarkable page, scrawled as if to be surreptitiously shown to its author's neighbor, an enduring testament to one gay activist's cheeky bitchiness. It reads simply, "The girls next to us are all transvestites." What does it mean that trans women were not only at a gay liberation organization's meeting, but that they were there in a group? Well, here's 3 ideas. 1, that trans women were present enough within political spaces like FREE so as to be noticeable, worthy of documenting. 2, that they consider themselves to be a part of FREE's constituency, in common cause with its actors, and either wedded to its political aims or invested enough that any of their critiques might be relevant. 3, didn't feel compelled to tone themselves down in order to be included as equal participants within gay liberation, and maybe within any movement they felt served or represented them, or held lessons for their own advocacy. The handwritten note, like this photo of trans women and or drag queens at the FREE-run downtown Minneapolis all-ages gay club, The Club, might be laden with implied or suggested meaning, but this doesn't mean that all trans history is incomplete. Some sources might demand that we conjecture or imagine, but others stare us right in the face. On a leafy block of the Minneapolis gayborhood, Gay House was founded in the spring of 1971 by an assortment of FREE activists, new-in-town political gays, and social work and chemical dependency counseling adjacent gays, buoyed by an injection of cash from a set of friendly street preachers who worked with street people, sex workers, and precarious gays in the surrounding area, as well as some federal Great Society funding. Gay House, like Free, is fairly well documented, but not necessarily as a site of trans history. Faced with the rejection of her middle-class Southwest Minneapolis family, Patrice turned to Gay House for answers, and Laura was there to receive her. When I asked Patrice to tell me of her first impressions of this mysterious and captivating stranger, she had one word: alive. Laura, like Patrice, was a young white trans woman who had transitioned by her early 20s. Unlike Patrice, she had been involved with local gay activism for as long as it had existed. Over the next 5 or so years, even after her falling out with the ragtag leadership of Gay House, Laura would remain a linchpin among trans women in the inner city who sought her counsel and cherished her friendship. Faced with a nearly wholesale rejection from civil society and virtually all of its public, private, and official institutions, locked out of almost all waged work, and typically rejected by families of origin, young trans women in the Minneapolis gayborhood, which you see here, needed that counsel and that friendship a lot. Faced with a largely unhelpful University of Minnesota gender clinic that had degenerated greatly from its prior form, trans women found themselves adrift, trying to cobble together hormone scripts and plead their cases to sympathetic authorities wherever they could be found. A pervasive atmosphere of violence, survival sex work, alcohol and drug abuse, all coexisted with culture, friendship, love, romance, and the general yearnings of young adult life. The 19 bar, which is sort of in the middle of the block here, a windowless, cheap mainstay that had been a gay bar since at least the early 1950s, served as the single place where trans women could nurse drinks, catch up, and sometimes even talk to one another. Margaret, one young trans woman living in the gayborhood at this time, remembers that when two trans women passed each other on the street, it was customary not to say hello or even to nod. As she put it, quote, "There was a sense that one person can pass, but two people can't." So serious were the potential implications of discovery and outness that the strong need for connection, togetherness, and friendship among these girls were actually outweighed, except in the relatively warm confines of the 19. Michael McConnell, one of the gay activists so central to trans women's political activity in the mid-1970s, worked as a bartender there in the early 1970s, and remembers the cadre of older gay men, or neighborhood mothers, who watched the door throughout the night, heading off fights and bashings. This imperative to hide for safety, to protect one's anonymity, makes the openness of Minnesotan trans women's political advocacy all the more remarkable. After 2 or 3 years of gay activist lobbying within conventional electoral politics, which saw Minneapolis and St. Paul pass gay inclusive non-discrimination protections and gay clout generally significantly expand, various actors within the state legislature moved to amend the Minnesota Human Rights Act, and trans women and their gay activist allies were not going to be left out of that conversation. By the time Verna held her press conference on the Capitol steps, she had spent a decade and a half living a broke and transient lifestyle, crisscrossing America in pursuit of medical and surgical transition. Bandied about until she met the particularly sympathetic and almost certainly lesbian clinical social worker Dr. Diane Olson at the Great Society-funded Pilot City Health Project in North Minneapolis, Verna pushed back against the rejections and humiliations of at least a half dozen clinicians who either rejected her as unstable or demurred that they could not provide the care that she requested. Rejecting the imperative to shrink away or move slowly, she was nonetheless not a barn-burning radical either, rather selling her appeals as simple and potentially uncontroversial. "Nowhere in the bill are we mentioned," she told the group of assembled reporters. "We want recognition so we can apply for jobs in our present forms without fear or discrimination." Verna was a street queen and former sex worker who lobbied elected power for inclusion in formal non-discrimination protections and was deeply wedded to medicalized transsexuality and the promise it held for her and for women like her. As I'll get into later, these seemingly warring commitments show with crystal clarity the insufficiency of some of our understandings of trans women as historical subjects. And Verna wasn't alone. In fact, she had called her press conference because the local media, despite 2 press releases, had failed to show up to the small protest she and Laura had co-organized, one that saw about a half dozen trans women banner and chant outside the Capitol. It was through the single existing record of this protest that I found Patrice, for example. Since there are no surviving photos of this event, I've included a photo of Tom Higgins at left and Michael McConnell at Pride in 1975. Higgins is most famous for his 1977 pieing of the anti-gay campaigner and subpar singer Anita Bryant at an Iowa press conference, but his central role in agitating politically for trans women's inclusion and the remedying of the problems they faced in daily life deserves attention. Because these daily concerns, hypervisibility and safety on the streets, employment and housing protections, and access to services, public assistance, and safe, accessible transition care really were the foundations of a remarkable political program during this period in the legislature. There's a huge array of literature produced as part of his program, some of which was authored by, or almost certainly authored by, Laura and Verna. However, the lion's share of the surviving written testimony, correspondence with agency heads and legislators, and press attention centers around Tim Campbell, Jack Baker, Mike, and Tom. Here's Jack and Michael with a trans woman activist between them, both in background and foreground, in a 1977 Minneapolis City Council subcommittee hearing, protesting proposed changes to the ordinance. Both staring us in the face and very much hidden away, the activist between Jack and Mike is another testament to the particular place of trans women within these histories. We might in fact read these gay male activists' ruckus making as an expression of trans political consciousness, despite their non-transness. While Laura, Verna, and others spoke here and there in hearings to the press, the most vociferous testimony was delivered by the boys. Similar to the fragment in the Free document, this is a tidbit that reflects both an out, open, and oppositional ideal among trans activists, and a desire to manage visibility and the risks that would come along with it. Here we see Tim Campbell holding a press conference in the men's bathrooms in the state capitol with heteros-only signs plastered on the walls and doors. When trans women and gay activists fought for access to public accommodations, they often meant bathrooms. Verna and other trans women had experienced myriad humiliations in this area, with employers in particular often restricting access, a fact of life that made waged work so hard to achieve for trans women in this period, all the more fraught. Why, we might ask, did Tim take the lead on this protest when the concerns were less his than theirs? And I don't have the answer. The literature that remains from this political drive is bawdy, poignant, and far too rich to really get into in this presentation. But it is notably all signed by a long list of gay activists, trans women activists like Laura and Verna, and interestingly, representatives of gay and lesbian-centered chemical dependency treatment centers and peer counseling services. In pamphlets and writings with titles like Catch 69, Rights/Wrongs, and The Gay Bill Now Stinks, 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 more moderate legislators and their moderate gay allies are lambasted with increasing ferocity, trans antagonism among gays and lesbians is detailed, and a curiously intense and marvelously simple political case for the civil rights of trans people is presented. Circulated far and wide, this literature sought to illuminate the lived conditions of trans women, achieve substantive policy changes at the university's gender clinic, and push the political condition of possibility just a little bit farther. The proposed legal language was similarly both and, radical, understated, very unique. Note that the language that radical gays and trans women sought did not hinge around gender identity or transsexuality or any such term that we would recognize today. Instead, the organizing principle was, quote, a self-image not associated with one's biological maleness or femaleness. Tim Campbell expounded on this idea in March 1975 testimony to state legislators, where he urged them, quote, in reality, those who brutalize us, those who would not hire us, pick their victims by visible signs that mean gayness to them. They define gays by these signs. We think their definition has to be dealt with in the law. This is not an inconsequential detail either. Most authors maintain that 15% of the gay population can be spotted. Moreover, studies conducted by cooperating organizations indicate that the vast majority of these persons come from racial minorities and lower-income families. We believe that these people too have the right to jobs, housing, and a chance at justice. They are the gays most in need of relief. We are also concerned about that large group on the periphery of the gay community called cross-dressers and sex changes. Medical schools have received thousands of dollars for surgery to carve persons from these ranks into what they would consider acceptable citizens. No ethics in the world could justify denying them the right to work after all this agony. Do we wish to create a class of human guinea pigs? Blended here were very clear appeals to change the material conditions of trans women's lives and a political economy of gay and trans life centered around comportment, presentation, and what is seen or heard by straight society, not what is claimed as an identity or a particular term of language. To Campbell and the other gays, trans women were the most visibly nonconforming and thus the most vulnerable, and no one could get ahead without them coming along. And for trans women who knew all too well the porous, blurry boundaries between gay and trans worlds and ways of life, an appeal like this had significantly more far-reaching implications for a chance at a new place in public life and the institutions of authority. The proposed amendments went up in flames, gay and trans inclusive versions both. And who do we think might have taken the blame for that? As this pamphlet produced by the moderate wing indicates, the presence of trans women and their daily concerns was central to the criticism. The out there, unruly, and embarrassing lunatic fringe that held incendiary press conferences in bathrooms and brought out and open trans women into committee hearings was saddled with the failure. And the limited existing historiography of this episode reflects a continued investment in that idea. This neglects the fact that a watered-down version explicitly excluding trans women failed in similar spectacular fashion in the next session. Despite chucking us over the side, the moderate gay activist boat nonetheless hit the rocks. As always, it seems, trans women were made to mean a whole lot of things to a broad assortment of people. The political albatross around gays' necks, the interloper in lesbians' coffee houses and reading groups, and yes, the continually inconvenient figure in queer histories to the present day. What does all this mean then? These thick and at times deeply contradictory histories of trans women's political engagements in the first decade of gay liberation in an American city most people consider marginal, if they consider it at all. I offer that contradiction to all of you in a stereotypical historian fashion, as it is, kind of unresolved, but at the same time, I believe that Verna, Laura, and their friends' lives invite us to think about trans women in this period of history in new ways. We are all... That is a different trans woman in the middle who I haven't mentioned in the paper. We're often presented with false choices when we read, hear, and think about women like these. We are told that street queens rejected and resisted authority, formed mutual aid networks and shared resources, and eked out a living in the face of complete rejection and immiseration. On the converse, we're told that assimilationist transsexuals sought medicalized transition, the trappings of a racialized, classed, normal life, and distance from radical or street-involved politics. This is clearly not enough. The street queen and the conventional transsexual were and are the same person, living in the same body, saying and writing the same words, leaving the same trace. Verna and Margaret were broke, intermittently homeless sex workers who lobbied the state legislature, brought suits in federal and state courts, wrote op-eds and longer pieces, held press conferences, and possessed contradictory attachments to gay and lesbian social movements, both very much bound up with them and very deeply individuated and separate. I'm not the first to notice that trans studies has left us with metrics and methods that simply do not work for the tricky problems of trans history. The problem of real people with real lives and their messy, warring, and ever-shifting commitments, desires, and senses of themselves. Trans women soaked up the libidinal energies and aggressions and insecurities of gay and lesbian people in the 70s, becoming something to be embarrassed of, to be disavowed. 50 years later, this is still happening. Women like Verna and Laura, with their attachments to trans medicine and conventional authority, are the inconvenient figures of trans studies. And yes, some trans histories, maligned as too binary, too normative, too assimilationist. I've aimed in my work to take the polemics and interventions of thinkers like Jay Prosser, Vivian Namaste, Andrea Longchu, and Emmett Harson Drager as far as they can possibly be taken. And so far, I do think it's working. For a final point in that direction, I want to also offer that we have not properly dug into the material question of transition enough in our work, in the political economy of a transition, in its lived and daily manifestations, the ways that transition both reflected and structured shifts in conditions of possibility among transsexuals. A sustained, breathlessly intense collective desire for safe, accessible, and affordable transition should be taken for what it was, a central political goal that manifested itself out loud in understudied records all over the global north. Transition is a process that happens at the edges of what is possible, that seeks to expand the terrain of the possible, that pushes and pulls it and tries to make it fit. We should dig into it, not treat it like a foregone conclusion. We see lots of writing on trans women wanting economic justice, wanting community and togetherness, wanting answers from systems and wanting to burn systems down. But what about this most fundamental element of trans life? Is it just too gauche to talk about medical transition in the polite company of trans studies? In closing, the girls next to us are all transvestites, are all transsexuals, are all queens, are all irreducible and unknowable and worth knowing. After we've worn down our pencil points thinking through who the girls at the free meeting were, what their ideas and dreams were, and what kinds of relationships they may have had to gay activism or feminism or the powers that be, I hope we still have time and energy left over to ask what I think is the more interesting question. Where'd they go for dinner after? Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for waiting and thank you so much for coming and thanks for the introduction from Jamie. The paper that I gonna talk about today came from an article that I published in the UWIC Graduate History Review. It's a special journal, trans history by trans historians, and my article title name is ทางสายที่ 3 The Third Pathway Novel as an archive inspiring a Kathoy her historian. And if you are interested in, you can find it out. It's online. And all right. So the part 1, how I read ทางสายที่ 3 novel or the Third Pathway novel. But anyway, first of all, what is ทางสายที่ 3? ทางสายที่ 3 is both a fictional, romance, and semi-autobiographical novel. It was written in Sakunthai magazine between 1980 and 1981. Later, it was published as a novel book in 1982. The novel was written by Kirati Chana, the first Thai transsexual woman novelist who received a section surgery with Dr. Stanley Bible at Mount San Rafael Hospital in 1975. The novel based on the writer's section experience in the US and inspired the author's own feelings. As you can see in the middle, the paragraph below is the meaning of ทางสายที่ 3 when she say like it is from the preface of the ทางสายที่ 3 novel. We are born to walk in the third pathway. The first pathway is belong to men who were born with strength and responsibility for family leadership. Another pathway is belong to women who were born with tenderness and giving birth for humanity. The pathway we are walking is in between. So the third pathway is a metaphor of third sex. And in Thai history, Kathoy was known as the third sex or third gender. But in this novel, the story is about a Kathoy character, a Kathoy protagonist who want to become a woman. What does it mean in Thai context in 1980, 1970 at the time? So she used her novel writing as a tool to try to like express what her desire, what she dreamed for, what she want to become, the person she want to become. So as you can see on the right hand over there, the third edition of ทางสายที่ 3 published in 2002 is consists of 870 pages in Thai language. So she spent like 2 years to write this novel and wrote like 870 pages, try to like express herself. And yeah, right now it's also available online. The copy if you are interested to look in. And here, this is a Sakunthai magazine. It's kind of like middle class woman fashion magazine. And from my memory, when I was young, when I go to the women's salon in my village, this kind of stuff gonna sit in the table in women's salon. So I guess that her main audience at that time is the Thai cis women, middle class people. Yeah. And Sakunthai. And this is the first edition of ทางสายที่ 3 novel, published in 1982. And you can see that it's very symbolic of like boy and girl, pink and blue. And the cover of the page and front page. And yeah, in that paper, I try to like contextualize how the novel ทางสายที่ 3 was grounded. For the first background is a Thai politics. It's a messy Thai politics in 1970s. We know that in Southeast Asia, the two main polarization around that time is like communism and democracy. And because of this period, many Thai intellectuals, many Thai writers try to like intervene, include their own self and their own ideology into their writing. And the novel ทางสายที่ 3 as well, because Kirati Chana tried to include her experience and try to express herself in the novel writing form. And also ทางสายที่ 3 also in the background of white transsexual women, celebrity, and autobiography after Christine Jorgensen debuted as a transsexual celebrity in the middle of 20th century. There are many more transsexual women who get section, write autobiography in the 1970s, 1980s. So Thang Sarisai is also in this background too. And here, this is what I learned from many fragmentary evidence about her life and work. I acknowledge that the biography of her is a complete one. And there's still many more that I need to find more about her. What I learned from her work, Chana novel writing can be categorized as a romantic and moral fiction. She not only known as Kirati Chana, but also as Ratasha, another pen name which she used in the novel writing guidebooks. She was also a columnist in Prachamati, which is a Thai newspaper in the USA, and she is also a professional floral designer. She wrote many books on floral arranging. Additionally, she was a founder of an American Thai foundation to help children living in poverty in Thailand. Here, this is her books. On the right hand is her 7 novel books. For my understanding, she always write a huge one. So mostly the novel consists over 400, 500 pages. Yeah, except the below one, just only 200 or 300, but mostly over 400, 500 pages. And in the middle is her writing book, which I also bought it from Thailand. She not only writing the novel, she do teaching too, and then she also have a floral arranging book because she a professional floral designer. And here, her experience to the word section capital. From a young age, Chana studied at Wat Benjamin Baptist School, which is one of the oldest male school in Thailand, and then get the higher education at the College of Fine Art in Bangkok. She moved to the US around the late 1960s. Mostly she lived in Los Angeles, and then Chana received a section surgery in 1975 when she was 25 years old with Dr. Stanley Biber. Before accessing section surgery, she had spent about 4.5 years receiving hormone treatment. And Chana worked for 5 years in the US to save money for the surgery. And at the time, the cost of sexual reassignment surgery, which she pays was nearby 5,000 USD for the operations and 3,000 USD for accommodation. And this included the expenses for 4.5 years hormonal therapy. Her section operation took place at Mount San Rafael Hospital in Trinidad, a small town in Colorado that was one known section capital. It's like Chana made the history. She became a first Thai person who got section surgery outside of Thailand. But in fact, it's not. This is from her interview. She said, I myself received a section operation in 1975, but I was not the first. There was another person who got the surgery, but she disappeared, and I don't know where she is. She was a famous costume designer who had worked in a tailor shop near Siam Square in the downtown Bangkok. Her name is Nong Anirudh. Nong was the first Thai who get the section surgery, but she did in Casablanca in North America. Here, there's a misinformation here, but there was indeed a surgeon named George Buku who do the surgery in Casablanca. So this is still a mystery about the first Thai person who do the surgery. But I think when I read her work, it's kind of make me to imagine about the history of trans medicine, especially in Thailand right now. In mainstream media, in social media, Thailand was not a global capital for sex change, blah, blah, blah. But imagine this way in 1970, where there almost completely nothing in Thailand, but she had the desire to become the person that she wants to be. She wants to become a woman. What we gonna do if we are in her shoes? So yeah, Kirati because she had an opportunity to move to US with her family, and then she come here to work in the US and get the surgery done in the USA. But what is missing from writing her life story? I think I want to thank to Myra because last year when we first met at the PhD conference and I did the presentation and Myra come to ask me like, oh, what does she do for the living? What the money came from, blah, blah, blah. And I was blank, but at the same time, I also realized that what I know is like her life after being success, a writer or photo designer, but what make a writer to become a writer, right? What make a writer to become a writer? So that what is missing from the paper that I wrote. But here, anyway, I found some new clues. This is a Thai magazine, the Bangkok Reader magazine. It's a BR magazine special issue. Tep Thida Pangpet or Section Goddess. On the cover of the magazine is not Kirati Chana, but Ratchanok Kasha. She was known as like a beauty queen, well-known beauty queen, Kathoy contestant. And as you can see in the cover, the design of the cover of the magazine very interesting. It's like beauty queen Kathoy and came out from the aluminum boxes. I think around that time, the Thai media in 1970, Thai media start to like spread the new representations of Kathoy people. So this is a modern Kathoy who have like a beautiful body, feminine body. And inside of the magazine, for sure, there was her portrait, Kirati Chana portrait, and her interview. What I learned from the Thai interview, the new clues. First, two things. First thing, she used to be a beauty queen. And second thing, she used to work as a theater performer on Queen Mary Cruise. It's Dutch in Los Angeles from that interview. Okay, and what I should do next after got that clue? I try to like find it on the Trans Archive database, and finally I found this magazine, Female Mimic magazine in 1974. And I think it's kind of like helped me to answer the question like, what does she do for a living while living in the US? Where did saving money for her section surgery come from? And how was her life as a Thai trans woman immigrant in the US in the 1970s and before becoming a writer? And here, this is some like new assumption. Kirati Chana worked in the US entertainment industry since the 1970s. Since she do the beauty queen, I guess she kind of like familiar with the gay scene bar in Los Angeles. And here, what I found. In 1974, Kirati Chana won the beauty queen competition named National Courtiers. From what I learned from here is an annual event and it started in 1970. The organizer was the Elvis Productions. And yeah, she was a beauty queen, and I also found kind of like the advertisements about the competitions in 1972. As you can see on the right hand, on the right hand there, like the price, the total price is like 1,250 US, and the grand prize, the winner got 500 US dollar. So probably part of that because she won the beauty queen. I think she got some money from that too. And not only Kirati Ratasha, but also Kitty was her name. Kitty was her name for beauty pageant competition, as you can see over there. And yes, because the traditional of beauty queens, there should be a swimming suit route and evening gown route and also performance. And you can see on the picture, Kirati Chana was the contestant number 5. Thank you. Okay. Okay, sure. And not only beauty queen, I also found that she was an actress in Hollywood film named The Woman Inside in 1981. She had a small role in this movie. I and Jamie had already watched it, and to be honest, it's quite really awkward film to watch it. But yeah, it's very important for the history. I think the main story of the woman inside, I think, is inspired by Christine Jorgensen's story, but instead of like the World War II background, no, it's like an American soldier who go to Vietnam War, and then the main character realized that, oh, I want to be the woman, and then come back to the U.S. and get the section surgery done, and it's paid by cis women. It's paid by cis women. It's Hollywood in 1980, and so there's a I think that someone uploaded on YouTube, and I tried. As we can see here, we can see nothing. It's at her, right? Just only like it's really dark scene, and in that scene, it's just only like maybe 5-10 seconds, and she speak it in Vietnamese language, and which I don't understand. But when the cast member came up at the end credits, her name was there in the square. Kirati Chana as a Vietnamese girl, and also Kitty Chana was there as a hairstylist for that movie. Okay, this is memory about her. Okay, in April 2018, I first met Kirati Chana at her house in Bangkok after coming back from the Moving Trans History Forward conference. And this is her house. She has like a beautiful cottage, writer cottage in suburban Bangkok. And because of she is a floral designer, so she decorate everywhere in her house, decorate everywhere and do the garden. And this photo was taken by Kirati Chana. I sit there and like writer, but in fact, the writer took this picture for me. And also, in 2018, Kirati Chana organized a novel writing workshop at her house in suburban Bangkok. For my understanding, she do this annually, but right now she stopped doing that. And from my understanding, there are many thousands of students who had an opportunity to learn the novel writing with her, and also learn the floral arranging with her. And I'm one of them too that had this opportunity to learn from her writing and learn a lot of things. I learned a lot of things from her work, and I think it's really like a good opportunity for me to writing about her life story and to like try to keep this story forward, right? And because of that, I think we have many things to discuss about the transfeminine subject. And I want to end here. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
So before beginning, I would like to thank the conference organizers and event staff for making our panel possible. I'm especially grateful for the ability to participate virtually in our discussion. I'm broadcasting from my home in Michigan. And finally, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists and our chair for being in conversation with me today. So the time has come to think about Harry Benjamin. For those familiar with trans studies, this provocation might seem strange or even ludicrous for a panel devoted to trans women's literary and cultural production, a persistently neglected topic that historians have too often ignored in favor of obsessively cataloging the intellectual and institutional history of the US transsexual healthcare system. As Jules Gill Peterson argues in Trans of Color Critique Before Transsexuality, the quote, overexposure of medicine as an available archive of transgender history, end quote, has significantly narrowed our field's epistemological scope, ensuring that the perspectives of white male sexologists, such as Benjamin, exert an outsized influence over what kinds of knowledge become legible as, quote, trans history. It is no coincidence, nor is it politically innocent, that our field is disproportionately relied upon US medical archives for historical knowledge about gender variance, treating medicine as the sole social institution worthy of sustained historical critique, while neglecting other key sites that produce racialized gender nonconformity: prisons and jails, workplaces and homes, courts and domestic violence shelters, bathrooms and brothels, segregated vice districts and, quote, family-friendly suburbs, and so on. As Kajia Min astutely observes, quote, outside political idealization, the field has little to say about what it feels like to be trans and what trans people actually desire, end quote. This absence reflects in part the efforts of Benjamin and his medical colleagues to serve as paternal spokesmen for transsexuals' personal problems and authoritative experts on the so-called social problem of transsexuality. a German-American endocrinologist who established a clinical practice in Manhattan and San Francisco with funding from the philanthropic Erickson Educational Foundation, Benjamin earned a reputation as the so-called, quote, father of transsexuality because he, unlike much of the US medical establishment, believed that a small number of morally deserving patients could psychologically benefit from hormonal treatment and sex reassignment surgery. The author of The Transsexual Phenomenon, a 1966 medical textbook widely regarded as a foundational text within trans medicine, Benjamin's research played a pivotal role in the development of a national network of gender clinics at US universities and prisons during the 1960s and 1970s. An ideologically diverse array of trans activist organizations, from Conversion Our Goal to Transsexuals in Prison Inc., have described Benjamin as an inspiration and rigorously engaged with his scholarship, building upon his brand of liberal sexology to make demands upon the state. As Susan Stryker argues, Benjamin might be best understood as a, quote, compassionate if somewhat paternalistic advocate for his transsexual patients, end quote. Neither a one-dimensional villain nor her heroic maverick, Benjamin appears as a decidedly ambivalent figure within much of the historiography, whose research produced complex and contradictory outcomes in the post-World War II history of transsexual civil rights. My paper today offers a slightly different interpretation of Benjamin's queer career, one that foregrounds his contributions to eugenics and racial science under the guise of promoting sexual freedom and white purity. Rather than focus on Benjamin's familiar scholarship on sex reassignment surgery and hormonal therapy, I contextualize and analyze his understudied research on trans women's paid labor within the sexual service industry. I argue that Benjamin imagined the prototypical, quote, transsexual prostitute as an impoverished white trans woman who needed to be rescued from the perceived moral degradation of urban sex work. Through a close reading of Benjamin's co-authored Prostitution and Morality, a 495-page expose of the US sexual service industry, I suggest that Benjamin utilized Orientalist and anti-Black logics to portray the, quote, transsexual prostitute as a modern subject of moral reform who might be coercively rehabilitated into a law-abiding citizen through her encounter with medicine. But to understand Benjamin's conception of sexual labor, it is essential to consider his participation in a transatlantic network of eugenics scholars. During the early 20th century, Benjamin immersed himself in eugenics research in the United States and Germany, corresponding with Paul Papione, the secretary of the Human Betterment Foundation, about his admiration for the Steinach procedure, the surgical removal of the vas deferens for the purposes of, quote, race improvement and increased masculine virility. As part of his scholarly contribution to eugenics, Benjamin initially focused on the, quote, problem of, quote, female prostitution in New York City, arguing in a 1939 study that commercial sex should, quote, neither be outlawed nor openly sanctioned, but rather carefully managed by a state agency responsible for protecting, quote, the finest prostitutes, end quote, from venereal disease. Although Benjamin did not explicitly clarify what he meant by, quote, the finest prostitutes, he contrasted these, quote, clean, quote, attractive, and, quote, ambitious women with the, quote, worst specimens of that profession, end quote, who worked in immigrant tenement districts, earned, quote, meager wages, displayed, as he put it, quote, wider promiscuity, and frequently appeared in court on misdemeanor charges. Like other eugenicists, Benjamin treated class, race, and ethnicity as markers of sexual morality, portraying working class immigrant sexual laborers as less hygienic than the implicitly white and US-born, quote, call girls he idealized as the, quote, finest prostitutes, end quote. Although Benjamin later embraced a more substantive critique of anti-prostitution laws, his subsequent scholarship still stigmatized individuals who worked in the commercial sex industry. In Prostitution and Morality, Benjamin and his co-author Ariel Masters argued that, quote, the transsexual prostitute frequently engages in, quote, promiscuous, often prostitutional intercourse, end quote, with masculine men to affirm her perpetually insecure sense of womanhood. Many trans women, of course, found sex with men to be a pleasurable and gender-affirming experience, but others articulated a strong sense of lesbian identity and desire, complicating Benjamin's attempts at imposing a universal heterosexuality onto his patients. Still, Benjamin estimated that a stunning 27% of his prospective patients were, quote, earning their living as prostitutes, end quote, though he expressed hope that these sexual laborers would, quote, settle down to a more normal existence, end quote, through marrying heterosexual men. Despite his dry clinical tone, Benjamin's discussion of transsexual prostitution bordered on the pornographic, reassuring anxious male readers that, quote, preoperative trans women excelled at oral sex and that their, quote, post-operative counterparts possessed, as he put it, quote, functional vaginas that felt sexually pleasurable to penetrate. The transsexual's, quote, female-like breasts, Benjamin and Masters explained, contributed to her, quote, extremely attractive appearance, end quote, citing Heidi Jo Starr and April Ashley, two famous white trans women, as sexually desirable products of transsexual medicine. Although Benjamin used ostensibly race-neutral language to describe transfeminine erotic laborers, a close reading of his work reveals a gendered Orientalism guiding his conception of transsexual prostitution. Like other US liberals during the Vietnam War era, Benjamin turned to Asia for political, intellectual, and sexual inspiration, romanticizing, quote, the East as more, quote, sexually enlightened than the purportedly, quote, puritanical West. In Prostitution and Morality, Benjamin and Masters argued that, quote, a large psychological gulf separated, quote, the transsexual prostitute from the, quote, transvestite homosexual prostitute, describing the former as a woman trapped in a man's body and the latter as an effeminate gay man who deceptively wore women's clothing to, quote, pass himself off as female, end quote. In terms of lived experience, the boundaries between transsexuality and transvestism were overlapping and fluid, but in Benjamin's taxonomically inclined mind, these sexological categories describe distinct groups of deviant people. Drawing on 19th century British colonial travel writings, Benjamin and Masters argued that transvestite homosexual prostitutes were, quote, perhaps most common and certainly most overt in the Middle and Far East, end quote, citing Indian hijras and Japanese danshos, two culturally specific gender roles, as evidence of, quote, the Orient's supposed embrace of gender fluidity and sexual freedom. From Benjamin's perspective, the United States' strict anti-prostitution laws reflected the nation's, quote, too rigid sexual morals, end quote, which stood in contrast to the presumed, quote, toleration of gender and sexual nonconformity found in the middle, quote, the Middle and Far East, the region whose varied sex gender systems Benjamin collapsed into a single Orientalist framework. Drawing upon ethnographic fieldwork in San Francisco and New York City, Benjamin constructed, quote, the transsexual prostitute, not only in relation to a romanticized Asia, but also in opposition to Black sexual laborers in the United States, a rhetorical move that deepened transsexuality's imagined association with American whiteness and treated Black transsexuality as a conceptual impossibility. Echoing a consensus within the field of environmental criminology, Benjamin and Masters argued that working-class Black neighborhoods functioned as queer training grounds for sexual criminality, claiming, quote, promiscuity and prostitution are taken for granted in the neighborhoods where they, Black people, grow up, end quote. Anticipating Daniel Patrick Moynihan's infamous 1965 report on Black families, Prostitution and Morality blamed Black mothers for supposedly failing to teach their children proper sexual and gender norms, asserting, quote, in many cases, the mother and the older sisters, along with numerous other neighborhood females, set the example of prostitution, end quote. Although urban police departments throughout the United States deliberately and systematically relocated sexual commerce into working class Black neighborhoods, Benjamin and his co-author downplayed these racially discriminatory practices, claiming falsely that police officers focused more on arresting, quote, white prostitutes, end quote, than their Black counterparts. In San Francisco, for instance, Black people comprise 63.5% of adults annually arrested for, quote, female prostitution, and 71% of those arrested for, quote, male prostitution, a misdemeanor charge almost exclusively applied to, quote unquote, female impersonators, according to San Francisco's Committee on Crime. Rather than critique law enforcement's well-documented practice of anti-Black sexual profiling, Benjamin singled out Black mothers as uniquely responsible for the concentration of illegal vice within Black neighborhoods, thus absolving the state of wrongdoing. To illustrate the purported connection between Blackness, sexual deviancy, and urban poverty, Benjamin published a case study of, quote, Q, a young Black man and sexual laborer who solicited clients in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. After noting that Q grew up in a foster home with a mother who, quote, kept him around for the welfare checks, end quote, Benjamin fetishized Q's presumed sexual prowess, writing, quote, he is tan-skinned and very muscular and masculine-looking. He wears tight-fitting trousers to emphasize his apparently rather large penis, end quote. Beyond invoking stereotypes of welfare dependency and fantasies of Black sexual potency, Benjamin contrasted Q's, quote, masculine-looking appearance with the hyperfemininity of S, a young white trans woman and Tenderloin sexual laborer who appeared to Benjamin as, quote, very slender with delicate, very white skin, end quote. In Benjamin's telling, the boundaries between S's whiteness and her trans femininity were thoroughly blurred, reflecting his tendency to conflate whiteness with femininity and Blackness with masculinity and gender deviance. While Benjamin portrayed Q in an extraordinarily negative light, describing him as, quote, amoral and possibly psychopathic, end quote, he discussed S with a much greater degree of sympathy, expressing his paternal desire to emotionally care for her and, as he put it, quote, normalize her life through sex reassignment surgery. Like other public health liberals interested in coercively rehabilitating law-breaking white youth, Benjamin treated S as an abnormal yet reformable victim whose sexual criminality was not a predictable product of her upbringing, but rather a strange aberration for a white child from a quote-unquote good family. By contrast, Benjamin never raised the possibility of rehabilitating Q, treating his participation in the Tenderloin sexual economy as an expected and perhaps inevitable outcome for a Black former foster child. Quote, there is a good chance, Benjamin wrote, that Q will, quote, commit some serious crime and, quote, spend the later years of his life as a guest of the state, end quote. Through using S as an allegory for the transsexual prostitute and Q as a metaphor for Black sexual criminality, prostitution and morality reproduced an anti-Black discourse of sexual deviance that was defined in opposition to idealized fantasies of white feminine purity. What does it mean that the so-called father of transsexuality, a white man who some describe as a, quote, pioneer in the field of trans medicine, embraced a conception of race and sexuality that echoed the pathologizing conclusions of Daniel Patrick Moynihan and other proponents of the so-called culture of poverty thesis? Beyond underscoring the shared genealogy of US sexology and Jim Crow, my paper highlights the degree to which Benjamin's thinking about transsexual womanhood cannot be divorced from the racial and colonial contexts in which he lived. To that end, my paper attempts to shed light on what C. Riley Snorton has called the violence of erasure, or the ways in which, quote, erasure is not about an absence, but a persistent and animating presence, end quote. Benjamin has received extensive treatment from a growing number of historians, yet his racial politics remain curiously sidelined within most trans historiography, despite their often explicit articulation within Benjamin's archive. During our discussion, I hope we consider the consequences of this, Benjamin's peculiar status as a quasi-paternal figure within trans collective memory, and future direction for scholarship on transfeminine historical subjects, given the sort of archival problems that we've all been sort of thinking about during our papers today. Thank you all so much.